if you know anything about politics today, it's that people don't agree. One of the hardest things for people first entering into historical discussions to come up against is that political divisions are not new. The questions of but the question is how do you deal with those political divisions? Textbooks will often talk about the French did this or the French did that, or the British did this or the British did that, as if there is this thing called British and this thing called French, when in reality, there's a lot of moving parts there, and you have to drill down and ask, okay, well, who believed what and when did they believe it? So we're going to approach the question of reform by looking at early 19th century political tendencies. Now, the shorthand for this is party. Party becomes the catch-all phrase for groups of people and how they approach politics. And if you're an American, you've probably heard George Washington and his admonition against political parties and forming political parties. That's kind of disingenuous to apply that today, because our understanding of party and 18th century understandings of party are not the same. So the modern understanding of party did develop about this time, and it was a transition away from families. In the 18th century, the word party referred to families. That we know about the Bourbons, we know about the Hanovers, the Hohenzollerns, right? We know about the big families, but there were wider circles of aristocratic families that also played a part in politics. If you read about earlier parts of European history, you see that there were competing dynasties within a kingdom, and they would fight for political power. This was more along what George Washington was thinking when he wrote about political parties, that it's very easy for people to see parties as a pursuit of power for personal interest, a pursuit for power for private interest. During the French Revolution, though, individuals started grouping based on ideology. Parties referred to people who shared common goals. The basic division then is between left and right. People on the left favored something new, people on the right favored something old. So this is where we get our terminology of people on the left and people on the right. People on the right want to preserve traditional ways of doing things. People on the left want to experiment with new ways. Maybe there's a better way. So democratic institutions require organization. It's not just about, I'm going to stand up and say, hey, y'all come with me for a while, and then you break up and say, y'all come with me for a while. People have tendencies that last for years. And when people organize, they organize with people who have common tendencies, right? They share common values, they share common ideas. And a lot of times in today's world, that means that I'm going to disagree with my family. I'm not going to agree with my mom or my dad or my brother or sister, and that's okay, because it's not about gaining wealth for the family. It's not about gaining power for the family. Instead of what it would be, it's about advancing an idea or a purpose for society. How do we make society better? Is society made better by holding on to old stuff, or is society better by trying some new stuff? One way for us to evaluate political tendencies in the early 19th century is to look at a single person and use that as a benchmark. A good benchmark or a good gauge for early 19th century political tendencies is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke lived at the end of the 18th century and responded to one of the most profound events in European history, the French Revolution. He wrote an extended essay in the form of a letter called Reflections on the French Revolution in 1790. He was responding to praise of the French revolutionaries. Now, this is before the Reign of Terror. This is before the Revolutionary Wars. He was simply responding to the attempt to rein in the French monarchy, that the National Assembly would balance the monarchy. And so he was reflecting, was this a good thing or a bad thing? Because many of the Frenchmen would then argue we're just following what the English did during the Glorious Revolution. During the Glorious Revolution, the English Parliament placed restrictions on the English monarchy. Now, 100 years later, the French are going to do the same. So he reflected on that, of whether that was a good or a bad thing. And he made a distinction between practice and theory. That England had a practice of Parliament and King working together. That over hundreds of years, kings and parliaments worked together and worked out a relationship. He criticized France because France was following a theory of constitutional government. That France had no practical experience with constitutional government. The French were an absolute monarchy. That was their tradition, that was their experience. And so while it was okay for the English to have a parliament and the king working together, it was really inappropriate for the French to experiment with an English model. And it was going to turn out badly. Because what made England stable was inherited principles. That political rights were not natural rights. Political rights were not universal rights. Political rights were inherited rights. In other words, what existed in England was a matter of inherited rights of Englishmen. That the English had a practice of being freedmen, right? Freedmen can participate in government, but the French had no experience with being free. So what Burke told them they should focus on was practical reform. He advised them to stop dabbling in constitutional reform, theoretical reform, trying to come up with some workable model, and simply alleviate grievances, which in very simple terms meant leaving the monarchy in place and asking the monarch to fix things that he had never fixed in his lifetime and his ancestors had not fixed in several hundred years. And his basic argument for that is that you can't have theoretical freedom. While you can say that all men are free, you really don't want all men to free, because some people can't handle freedom. And the only way to know if they can is over a long extended period of time. And if someone abuses that freedom, the government ought to take it away. So while Burke endorses the concept of constitutional change, that constitutional change can only happen over a long period of time, really generational change. When we see early 19th century political tendencies, then in many ways they are responding to Burke, or at least the questions that Burke brought up is, should a king be limited? How much limitations should they place? Should a government institute constitutional reforms? How big should the constitutional reforms be? Should it avoid constitutional reforms? How fast should it reform? And it's not hard to imagine that there were wide varieties of answers to that, but we're going to look at a couple of basic answers. So first are the ultra Tories. The word Tory refers to the monarchical party in 18th century England. The Tories favored the monarchy, and so going into the 19th century, the ultra Tories, obviously favored the monarchy. And they believed that reform invites revolution. But the problem in France was that the king invited them to Versailles. In other words, France would not have had a revolution if the king had not initiated a reform process. So the best thing that you can do in government is never attempt reform. Because as soon as you attempt reform, the revolutionary is going to come along and push for more changes. Never take changes. What provides stability then would be monopolies. Governments should use monopoly power to control society. Political monopolies, economic monopolies, religious monopolies. In other words, where a small group of people can control the many. Because as soon as the many get access to power, society deteriorates. They favored political deference. That the better people in society, the king, the nobles, the priest, ought to call the shots. And the lesser people in society ought to defer or yield to their betters. Very simply, women should defer to men. Children should defer to parents. Subjects should defer to rulers. It would be foolish to allow unsophisticated, uneducated people to participate in politics because it would lead to chaos. Once again, look at what happened in France. The ultra Tories supported the Anglican Church, the Church of England. They did not support religious freedom. They were in favor of toleration, right? They would tolerate people. They would not try to stamp out dissenters, people who disagreed with the Anglican Church. They had realized that it had gone too far, right? That was an established toleration, was an established principle in England, but they were not going to separate church and state because they argued that the monarch achieved his throne by God, by the will of God. And then by extension, peers achieve their title by the will of God. Right? The people that are in charge of society are there by divine right. To get rid of the church, right? To disestablish the Church of England would then be to invite further social and political reform. It would invite leveling. They're not interested in that. Economically, the ultra Tories supported crown chartered companies, the most famous of which is the East India Company. the East India Company since the time of Elizabeth, right, beginning of the 17th century, had a monopoly on trade with India and China. In particular, it had a monopoly on tea. And so the ultra Tories favored the East India Company, the Levant Company, the West India Company. They thought long distance trade still ought to be in control, under the control of the crown. In other words, they were not in favor of, quote, free trade. They supported the Bank of England, right? The Crown's Bank. Ultra Tories were very much committed to preserving traditional English political institutions, government institutions, religious institutions. In other words, they weren't going to do anything that would lead them down the road of a wicked French Revolution. When they read Burke, right, or had conversations about whether the French Revolution was a good thing or a bad thing, ultra Tories answered, certainly not a good thing. A splinter group from the ultra Tories were liberal Tories. Obviously, they're Tories. Obviously, they favor a monarchy, but they're liberal, so they want something new. They want to, in some areas, they believe in, quote, freedom, liberty. So what did that mean? Well, that gradual reform was a necessary evil. That without practical reform, the English aristocracy invited revolution. That in order to preserve the state, in order to preserve the church, in order to preserve property, the government needed to remove the harmful effects of monopolies. That monopolies abused their power. Religious monopolies, political monopolies, economic monopolies. And so liberal Tories believed that they would protect the Church of England, they would protect large corporations, they would protect the crown by stripping away monopolies. And in the place of artificial monopolies, natural monopolies would grow. They believed that power would naturally concentrate based upon success rather than legalization. In other words, society would return to a natural hierarchy. That the monopolies, the monopolies from the earlier periods of English history had propped people up artificially and hindered the natural success of others. Once the monopolies were gone, the best and the brightest would rise to the top, and they could then have concentrated power. But they would only hold on to power as long as they were good at it. The Whigs had a much more positive approach to reform. The Whigs also get their name from the 18th century. The Whigs were the parliamentary force. While the Tories supported the monarchy, the Whigs supported Parliament. The Whigs were the followers of the Glorious Revolution. The Whigs thought that Parliament could be an effective and needed to be an effective check on monarchical power. And so when they saw agitation, right, street demonstrations and protests, they saw that as a sign of lost confidence. Governments need the confidence of the public. street protests, street violence is a sign of lost confidence, and that the government needs to do something to address those problems. At the beginning of the 19th century, Charles Fox organized Whigs at his house, Holland House. And when he did this, he was in the minority, because by the time he was gathering people in his house to talk politics, the French Revolution had continued to deteriorate. Street violence increased. They chopped the head of the king off. Obviously, by 1804, Napoleon declares himself emperor and is running across all of Europe. And the English, who had never particularly had a good thing to say about the French, had even less of a good thing to say once the French Revolution had run its course from 1789 to, let's say, even 1800. But Fox kept alive this idea that Parliament was a balance against despotism. So Fox looks over what's happening in France, and he said, yeah, France did deteriorate into anarchy. And it, on the other side of that anarchy was despotism. But the way to avoid that would be a stronger Parliament. That Parliament ought to reform itself. That parliamentary reform, particularly the reform of the House of Commons, would solidify the English Constitution. Now, at the far left of the extreme were radicals. Right? Radicals really didn't want to have anything to do with that talk of preservation. They wanted something new. And so they wanted an immediate end to all monopolies. Immediate end to political monopolies, immediate end to religious monopolies, immediate end to economic monopolies. These radicals were committed to the idea of liberty. Individuals ought to be free to pursue their own political, religious, and economic agendas. In particular, they took aim at the unreformed system, calling the unreformed system artificial. That it was important to make the House of Commons democratic, to have a democratic system in the House of Commons, because they argued that monopolies lead to instability. Political monopolies lead to instability. Religious monopolies lead to instability. Economic monopolies lead to instability. In other words, these radicals on the far left were pretty much in line with what the American revolutionaries were doing, except most of these radicals weren't talking about eliminating the monarchy. They would see fit to strengthening the House of Commons. But that meant the House of Commons would be a true balance against monarchical and aristocratic interest. Right? In other words, the English constitutional theory said one thing. They wanted that constitution to live up to what it was saying, and that the democratic institutions ought to be really democratic. They based this on a redefinition of property. For generations, property was defined as land. Well, most of the radicals didn't own land. They didn't even own a business. So how could they then justify political participation? John Locke had argued that political participation should be limited to property owners. Well, if you're working in a factory or you're working in a blacksmith shop, you don't own any property. Early 19th century radicals would say, well, then as long as a person is contributing to society, they ought to participate. In other words, adult male households. Because a person's labor was a form of property. Right? They may not own land, they may not own a business, but they create wealth through their labor. Right? Their labor, as long as they're working, right? Not a vagabond, not a pauper, not a beggar. Their labor contributes to the betterment of society, and because of that contribution, they ought to have a say in how society is run, which means that they're in favor of universal manhood suffrage. This was a very radical idea in the 1820s. But when they saw the political abuses, the economic abuses, the religious abuses, they argued the only way to get rid of that abuse was through the elimination of all monopolies, political monopolies, religious monopolies, economic monopolies. These individuals then clearly had differing opinions on whether England was advanced or not. The ultra Tories were satisfied. They looked at this and said, you know, the monarchy is doing its best to avoid the chaos that's in France. The Whigs said, you know, we could do better. Whigs and liberal Tories said we could do better if we do a few tinkering around the edges. So Tories, ultra Tories, Whigs came down on the side of, you know, there are limited things that the English government can do, but if you open the door too much, it's all going to fall apart. There's only a handful of radicals that want widespread or larger political changes. And going into 1830, there's really no evidence that they had the upper hand in any way. Tories, ultra Tories, Whigs all held the political positions in England, and radicals were on the outside.